On the 40th anniversary of the Battle of Orgreave, we'll hear from former miners and police officers about that pivotal and violent moment in the 1984 miners' strike. Hello there, good evening. Thank you for joining us. 40 years ago, striking coal miners from across Britain travelled to South Yorkshire's Orgreave coking plant in an attempt to disrupt deliveries. It was 3 months into a strike sparked by the threat of pit closures. Thousands of miners took part in the mass picket on the outskirts of Rotherham. They were met by around 6,000 police officers in what became known as the Battle of Orgreave. It was a pivotal moment in the year-long miners' strike and one of the most violent episodes in British industrial history. More than 100 picketers and police officers were injured. 95 miners were arrested and faced trial for riots and unlawful assembly until the charges were dropped a year later. Many of those involved say they still need answers about what happened and why. Later, we'll be hearing from a former police officer who was there and what the political parties are saying about calls for an inquiry. But first, we've been speaking to Steve Brunt and Robert Plant, two Chesterfield miners who were at Orgreave that day.
There's been the worst violence so far at the Orgreave coking plant near Sheffield.
The 100 Days War in the coalfields reaches a new climax with the most open, bloody battle yet between miners and police.
You've got to remember with Orgreave, we were directed there. This is a time when we were being stopped going anywhere else. We couldn't go into Nottinghamshire, South Derbyshire, sometimes into South Yorkshire were difficult.
Mounted, will you withdraw, please?
This time, they were telling us where to go, where to park and everything. And particularly on that day, on June the 18th, when the call had gone out, and we did get lads from South Wales, we did get lads from Scotland and from all over the country, really. What that demonstrated for me today was the enormous amount of resources in terms of police numbers. They'd geared up for that, and we were set up to fail and get battered, and that was simple.
It was a beautiful day, red hot. I got trainers on, jeans on, t-shirt. I were ready for no battle, like nobody else. We just had a wrestle, actually, me and my friend. We had a bit of a laugh and what have you. And then we stopped and got up, and we saw that the police lines were opening. And he says, something's happening. I says, oh, there's nothing happening. The next thing they did, the horses came galloping through, and they trampled this guy about 5 or 6 metres from me, like it were okay to do that. And they just carried on going up the field. A few minutes later, I'm looking around, and the next thing I got arrested by the snatch squad. We went into the holding station where everybody who'd been arrested were queuing up to take the details. In the queue, there was a guy in front of me being beat by the police. One of them got me in the headlock. The other guy was pushing his shoulder down. And I counted 40 punches to the face. I thought, that don't look very good. And then my legs were going a bit rubbery. I thought, is it me next? And then rammed his head into the bottom of the stairwell, which I thought was just sheer brutal. There was no need for none of that.
Certainly the number of missiles thrown and the determination of the pickets to get through the lines has been as severe as anything that I've seen.
Burning barricades remained when the pickets finally withdrew. They demolished a stone wall to provide ammunition and act as an obstruction to the mounted police.
I do know, and on heart, none of our lads took bricks or stones. I mean, were accused of it. They didn't. The only time when it really got violent, and as I saw on this film, and they pulled that wall down, they were trying to stop the police horses running up the road.
Minding my own business, that, mate. First day on picket line is this for this lad, and that's what he gets.
It was very worrying and harrowing to think that you could have a life sentence. You know, I'm only 27. You know, thinking, what, you're going to get a life in prison for? demonstrating about trying to save your job.
Well, last week I spoke to Tony Mundy, a retired Hertfordshire police officer who was drafted to help police the miners' strike. He was on the front line at Orgreave.
So we were in the front. There was bricks, stones and other things coming through the air. This seemed to go on for a long time. Then mounted officers, followed by officers with short shields, went through. I actually arrested an individual because there was a big surge towards our lines. As I was grappling with this individual and we were on the ground, surrounded by people, if we describe them as pickets. Basically, those people could have done me a lot of damage, but they didn't.
So you were asked to change your statement, weren't you? How did you feel about that?
Well, the senior South Yorkshire detective said to everybody very strongly, stop writing. He said, it's not a request, it's an instruction. Then dictated what I'd call a couple of paragraphs, effectively talking about fear and expectation of violence. And I recognise that as part of the definitions for riot.
And how did you feel that you've been asked to do that, Tony?
Well, it was outrageous, and protested, but we're told it was an order. And I thought, well, surely there's going to be a situation, either at court or a misconduct inquiry, where this can be explained, because in that room there must have been, say, about 20 officers, I'd say. And it's quite ridiculous that everyone in those circumstances would have the same opening paragraphs, which most importantly were not our words.
Would you support or take part in an inquiry about Orgreave?
So the short answer is yes. But the question is, why now, after 40 years, are we still waiting? Because the essence of this for me is this. This was clearly corrupt behaviour by South Yorkshire Police. I really wanted and expected, once the case collapsed, that there would be a misconduct investigation and certainly a criminal investigation, because you're talking of perverting the course of justice, misconduct in a public office, and perjury. But nothing has ever happened, and that's wrong.
Well, in a statement, South Yorkshire Police say it would not be appropriate for the South Yorkshire Police of today to seek to explain or defend the actions of the force in 1984, as everyone involved in policing the miners' strike has long since retired and the information we hold has not been properly assessed. We have been very clear about our intent to make as much of the relevant documentation as is possible available to the public. To that end, a small team funded by the then Police and Crime Commissioner is reviewing and cataloguing all of the material held by the force and ensuring anything released is done so in line with the requirements of GDPR. There are 1,474 files of material which amount to 82,913 pages. When this work is complete, we will seek to follow the process undertaken both by the Home Office and the Cabinet Office and place the documents in a recognised public archive. This is expected to take another 18 months to 2 years. Well, the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign has been pushing for an independent investigation since 2012. Last week, Labour committed to some form of inquiry into Orgreave. In the party's manifesto, they promised to bring the truth about the events at Orgreave to light. We asked Labour for further details about the type of inquiry they're proposing, as well as its expected timeframe and cost, but they've not yet responded. We approached all the major parties to see where they stand on this. The Conservatives say they would not hold an inquiry if re-elected. Their position on this hasn't changed since they ruled out an investigation into Orgreave in 2016. Whereas the Liberal Democrats, Reform UK and the Green Party all told us they were supportive of an inquiry in principle. Well, earlier I spoke to Conservative peer and chair of the Select Committee on Statutory Inquiries, Lord Norton of Louth. I started by asking him where he stands on whether there should be a public inquiry into Orgreave.
Well, I don't have a position on any particular inquiry. I'm more concerned, because of my position chairing a committee looking at inquiries, with the actual process themselves, establishing inquiries, and then particularly importantly, what happens once an inquiry has reported.
So tell us about that. What challenges come with launching a public inquiry?
Well, a number of issues with launching one, there are even more with once a committee of an inquiry has reported. In establishing a committee, you've got the issue of what type of inquiry. They can be non-statutory, they tend to be relatively quicker to undertake, they don't have the sort of infrastructure that statutory inquiries have. And statutory inquiries, which people affected by particular issues who call for inquiries tend to prefer, because they are endowed with legal powers to summon witnesses to require evidence, but they can be quite lengthy and expensive. So some are relatively short, but others can go on for years. They can cost millions.
Who pays for these public inquiries?
It comes out of public funds. They're established, particularly statutory inquiries, because they are established under the Inquiries Act 2005.
It's 40 years since the Battle of Orgreave. What would an inquiry achieve?
Inquiries can be set up, but it depends what purpose that they're established for. So is it going to be sort of fact-finding? Is it looking at fault-finding, so what went wrong, if you like, who to blame? Or is it a lesson-learning inquiry? If there's been a problem, what caused it and what can be done to prevent its recurrence in the future? But once a committee has done its final report, it's published, the committee, the inquiry, ceases to exist. There is no formal mechanism that implements whether recommendations have been implemented, or no formal requirement for them to be implemented. So it really is dependent on those at whom the recommendations are directed, which typically tends to be government, as to what happens to them.
Lord Norton, thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.
And you can read a special report on the BBC News website about the events at Orgreave and the aftermath, told through the eyes of those two who were there on that day.